Now I want to talk about Soren Kierkegaard, which brings us into a rather different world, okay? There's some parallels between Kierkegaard and the Ritschlians, but he's not a Ritschlian. And I'm even dealing with him out of chronological order. Harnack, I mentioned, died in 1930. Kierkegaard, you see his dates, 1813 to 1855, so he is mid-19th century. So I'm going way back in time to reach Kierkegaard. Why do I do that? Well, because Kierkegaard really didn't have a whole lot of influence in his own day, but he came to have influence much later. He came to have influence in the 20th century when people really started to read his books seriously. And he had a tremendous influence upon neo-Orthodox theologians like Barth and Bultmann and Brunner. And he also had a tremendous influence on secular philosophers in the 20th century, people like Heidegger and Sartre. So I'm trying to deal with Kierkegaard in a context which eventually will bring him fairly close to these 20th century developments. Kierkegaard, tremendously important thinker. His writings were probably the most important factor for motivating people to move beyond Ritschlianism, okay? Barth and Bultmann came along later, and they read Kierkegaard, and because they read Kierkegaard, they moved away from their teachers, who were Ritschl and Hermann and Harnack. Barth had a love-hate relationship with Kierkegaard. His early works were very Kierkegaardian, and then later on he said he was moving away from Kierkegaard, but scholars debate whether he actually did or not. Number 3 on page 77, Kierkegaard also had much influence upon secular philosophers, the existentialists, as I mentioned. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the language analyst, read Kierkegaard before it became fashionable to do so. And I may be able to point out to you some aspects of Wittgenstein's thought later on in which I think he may have been influenced by Kierkegaard. So, but at any rate, it's hard to classify Kierkegaard. He's not really, I'm tempted to try to integrate him with this movement called liberal theology, and he's really not. I mean, his whole mentality is different from that. He shares some beliefs with the liberals and with Barth later on, but he's really an individual, and he would have been happy for me to say that about him. He doesn't have any close connections. He doesn't have any close predecessors, and he doesn't have any close followers. He's really an individual. I think most of his theology is evangelical. Most of what he says I respond to positively. But there's some little quirks about Kierkegaard that we perhaps need to give some attention to. Very interesting biography. You see under personal problems there, B, background 1, personal problems. His major concern is, how do I become a Christian within Christendom? All right? Kierkegaard is a Dane, and he attends the Lutheran State Church of Denmark. And in the Lutheran State Church, at least this is Kierkegaard's evaluation of it, people seem to be engaged in nominal Christianity that is without passion. They get buried, they get baptized in the church, they get married in the church, they get buried in the church lot. Some of them at least attend church, because they're told to do so, because that's the custom in Denmark. But few of them have any passion for Jesus Christ. But look, if Jesus is the Lord, if Jesus is the Creator, if Jesus is the Redeemer from sin, certainly our relationship to Him should be the most important relationship that we have. And we should be passionate in our devotion to Christ and our devotion to bring about in society the changes that Jesus wanted to bring about. Well, so what is going on here? I mean, why is it that people can be surrounded by Christianity, by all these trappings of religion, and yet they have no meaningful relationship to Christ? And this is what Kierkegaard is wrestling with in all his many books and in all of his type of thinking. Now, some people tried to say that we should transform. The way to make Christianity really cogent is to present it in a respectable philosophical form. And the respectable philosophy in Kierkegaard's day was Hegelian idealism. So we find a way, and Hegel did this himself, find a way to integrate the gospel into the Hegelian triads, and therefore you see the gospel as containing symbols of philosophy that give you great insight into the world. And isn't that something that you can be excited about? Well, Kierkegaard says no. Reducing Christianity to a philosophical system is just the worst thing that you can do. And so Kierkegaard is highly opposed to this philosophical approach. He's very well educated, but he does not write in an academic style. He writes very personal observations about his own life, about the culture around him, about the decisions that people make. He wrote using pseudonyms. He admires Socrates, and of course in the Socratic dialogues you have Socrates discussing things with other people. And so Kierkegaard tries to create dialogues like this in his own writings, and by putting different views up against one another. And one way he did that was to create different characters that he would give different names to, Johannes Climacus and so on. He would use those as pseudonyms. He would write a book and say that the author was Johannes Climacus. Is he presenting Kierkegaard's views, or is he presenting an alternative view that he wants us to consider? Is this Kierkegaard speaking, or is this Climacus speaking? And often he didn't tell us, he just let us kind of figure it out, with the idea that somehow if you think about this view and if you think about that view, maybe you'll come to understand something of the issues. And this is the alternative to doing what the Hegelians did, trying to reduce everything to a system. Here you have no system. You just have a lot of miscellaneous voices presenting their positions, interacting with one another. So there is no system. This is what Kierkegaard called indirect communication. It's one form of indirect communication, and we want to get at that in a little bit. Kierkegaard opposed the idea of a theological or philosophical system. He believed that abstract concepts cannot adequately describe individual existence. And that's the important thing, you see. How can I become a Christian within Christendom? Not by understanding some abstract or general concepts. That's the philosophical prejudice, isn't it? That's what Plato told us to do, to think about the forms, to think about the general nature of things. Kierkegaard says, no, what we need to do is to understand the individual, to understand the nature of individual choice, individual decision. And so abstract concepts cannot tell you how to develop a vital relationship with Christ. Only an understanding of human decision is going to do that. I mean, you need to make a decision. You need to have a personal relationship with Christ. And so if we're going to talk about anything, if we're going to study anything, it's got to be a study of individuals, of individual personal relationships. Arguments, propositional knowledge, never in themselves force one to choose or force one to act. Arguments are in hypothetical form. If P, then Q. They yield a conclusion only if the premise is accepted. But accepting the premise requires a free decision. And once you reach the conclusion, you need to make another free decision, namely to act upon the decision that you've made. This decision and this action is what is most important to human nature. It's not like the Greeks tried to define what a human being is. Aristotle said that human beings are rational animals. Well, what does that tell us? It tells us that we should live according to reason and so on and so forth. Kierkegaard doesn't think that's helpful. Kierkegaard thinks that what's distinctive to human nature is the decisions that we make, what we make of our lives, not what we are, not our essence, if you will, but our existence, our choices, our decisions. And therefore, abstract concepts are very limited in value. So what we need is a concrete description of the nature of decision. That's difficult to convey in words, which by their nature are somewhat abstract. Indirect communication seeks, without abstract description, to give one a sense of how this takes place. So again, the different voices, the pseudonyms, the different views being put over against one another, showing why one author made this choice and another person made this choice and somebody else chose to think this way and so on. This is the indirect communication of Kierkegaard. And he thinks there are additional reasons why the Christian faith, as a human decision, you gotta, I don't care how Calvinistic you are, you've got to decide to put your faith in Jesus. Choose you this day whom you must serve. Don't be the kind of Calvinist who says we don't make decisions. Be the kind of Calvinist that says, yeah, the Lord foreordains them, but we got to do them, okay? And Kierkegaard is right, I think, in saying, yes, we do need to make a decision to be friends with Jesus rather than the devil. So, Christian faith cannot be conveyed through the communication of abstract concepts. You've got to come up with a way of understanding human decisions. Well, I could belabor this on and on and on. Just about everything Kierkegaard wrote was about this. People kind of find it difficult to find a continuing theme in Kierkegaard's writing. So this is it. He's trying to show what it's like to make decisions for Christ. I want to talk about his stages on life's way. There's a book that he wrote by that title, but he deals with these stages in other books as well. And he says that basically each of these stages is what we would call today a lifestyle. It's a way of living, and as part of that way of living, it's a way of thinking too. So you find yourself in one lifestyle. How do you change into another lifestyle? Well, that's not an easy thing to do. He distinguishes three of these lifestyles or stages, the aesthetic stage, the ethical stage, and the religious stage, and then he divides the religious stage into two, religion A and religion B. The aesthetic stage is uncommitted, irresponsible, dedicated to pure enjoyment, and therefore entirely selfish. You probably had a roommate in college like this, huh? No, I'm just kidding. Probably you wouldn't, but some of us did. But there are an awful lot of footloose folks in the world, and a lot of them are on college campuses. A lot of them just don't know what they're doing. A lot of them have graduated from college and they're still living in their parents' basement, and they have no idea what they're going to do for a living. All they want to, but they're pretty sure they want to have some fun. So they're uncommitted, they're irresponsible, they're easily bored. And if you say, you really ought to take a stand for this, maybe a political principle, maybe religious faith, something like that, you need to take a stand on principle, they'll say, no, that's boring, that restricts me, that keeps me from doing what I want to do. Sometimes these folks are kind of charming, but they can become diabolical, manipulative in wanting to get their way all the time. But this way of life cannot be ultimately satisfying. People sometimes live this way for many, many years, but there is a tendency for people to get tired of it, to grow weary, to be full of self-disgust, to say to themselves, is this all there is in life? Going from one party to another one, getting drunk every night, is this all that life offers me? And it leads to a kind of despair. The problem here, says Kierkegaard, is that people like this are unwilling to choose a way of life. They're simply moving from moment to moment. But have they made a choice simply by refusing to make a choice? At any rate, it's difficult to turn this around. But there is another way to live, says Kierkegaard. There is the ethical stage. Ethical stage is Kantian ethics, as he understands it. Kant taught that ethics is absolute obedience to the moral law. And so it involves mutual obligation. It involves treating you the way I'd like you to treat me, treating you the way I'd like to treat everybody in the world. So really there's something universal about it, a life of obligation for everybody. You don't follow your individual inclinations. In this sense, it's the opposite of the aesthetic stage. This is something universal for everybody. Interestingly, the ethical stage, even though it's opposite to the aesthetic stage in some ways, in other ways it fulfills the aesthetic stage. It incorporates the aesthetic stage. Because after all, what is more fun than living a life of commitment? I mean, once you get the hang of it at least, isn't it wonderful to live for a great cause? How many movies have been dedicated to people getting together and giving up their miscellaneous pleasures for a great cause? I mean, isn't that something that doesn't that fulfill? So in a kind of paradoxical way, the ethical stage is against the aesthetic, but it also fulfills the aesthetic. And that, frankly, in Kierkegaard's anti-Hegel, but frankly, this begins to sound a little bit like Hegel, because Hegel thought that when you move from one stage to another, the higher stage negates the lower stage, but the higher stage also fulfills the lower stage. Remember the three meanings of aufheben, to preserve, cancel, and fulfill. So in the ethical stage, you find your duties based on your station in society. However, there's frustration here. Just as there was frustration in the aesthetic stage, there's frustration in the ethical. And in the ethical stage, the frustration is that we don't have the power to keep the moral law. We try so hard, but we can't do it. And isn't that what the New Testament tells us? Isn't that what your preacher tells you every Sunday? You don't have the power in yourself to do this. So, but there's an alternative, okay? There's another lifestyle that meets that need, and that is religion, okay? And religion gets us talking about the grace of God. It gets us talking about God's provision for us. There's, first of all, religion A, however. And you have to distinguish between one kind of religion and another. They're not equally okay. Religion A is the kind of religion that you find in the Danish state church. And this includes all forms of religion that are formalized and fall short of true faith. And this includes paganism. But it also includes some forms of Christianity. And Kierkegaard, comes pretty close to equalizing formal Christianity with paganism. There's a very controversial section in his concluding unscientific postscript where he says that the pagan who prays with passion to a false god and the formal Lutheran who prays to the true God without any passion are equal in a way. That's a little bit, Kierkegaard has been criticized for saying that there's really no distinction between a false god and a true God. That's not what he's saying. He makes very clear that in his view the pagan is praying to a false god and the Lutheran is praying to a true God. But he is, equalizing these events. He's saying that this passionless prayer gets you no farther than paganism. So that's religion A. Trying to relate to God, trying to absolve your guilt based on your own resources, recognition of the divine, but you have an essentially passive relationship to Him. You don't decide, you don't choose. Characteristics of religion A include resignation, where you renounce your own relative goals, suffering, sorrow over this renunciation, recognizing the need of transformation, feeling of guilt. You recognize that you have a partially severed fellowship with the unknown God, and passive participation in ceremonies, ordinances, and religious duties, as in the Danish state church. But then there's an alternative to that, and here comes the best alternative. This is religion B, which is true Christianity governed by faith alone. Unlike religion A, religion B comes at God's initiative. God establishes it by entering in to history. Kierkegaard is very interested in what he calls the qualitative distinction between time and eternity, and God, who is eternal, now breaks through that distinction to come into history through the incarnation of Jesus Christ. This happens, this is a God thing entirely. This is not something that we can work up. This is His initiative, establishing a relationship with men, and it's impossible for us to understand how this can happen. How can the eternal enter time? But this is what God has decided to do. The object is what he calls the absurd, the absolute paradox, the eternal entering time. I don't think that Kierkegaard believed that this is a real logical contradiction. I think that he would have said this is an apparent contradiction. But there's something mysterious about it. It's eternal truth relating to an existing individual. Okay, so we get the individual here. It's not resolved in a higher synthesis as in Hegel. It goes beyond religion A, not just going beyond the evidence as religious A does, but its belief in something which itself is paradoxical, even transcends the moral law, which is the big thing in the ethical stage. This is what he calls a teleological suspension of ethics. There's a book he wrote called Fear and Trembling, where he talks about Abraham offering his son Isaac on the basis of a divine command. Well, that divine command, says Kierkegaard, went against God's own ethical standards. And so Kierkegaard says it amounts to a teleological suspension of the ethical. And so religion is something higher than ethics. It's this personal relationship with God. Now, I don't agree with his analysis there. I think that God was not violating the principles of ethics, but God does intervene. And of course, remember, Abraham never does actually sacrifice Isaac. God prevented him from doing that. So there's nothing about the passage in Genesis 22 that violates the law of God. But anyway, there is something remarkable that happens there. It's God's personal relationship with Abraham, not Abraham's previous understanding of what's right and wrong. It's that personal, individual relationship that makes the difference. Religion B is not a doctrine, but an existence communication by which we are actually transformed. It contains a sense of sin, which cannot be explained but only experienced. How can an innocent person fall into sin? Kierkegaard does not accept the historicity of Genesis 3. He believes that this is mainly a description of the choices that everybody makes. But he's quick to stress that everything in religion B is personal. And here he's a little bit like the Ritschlians, and Hermann especially. There's a personalism about it. It's my rebellion against the personal God. How do we live? Being forgiven this way. We live in the Spirit, not by formal religion. We can give reasons for our choices, but we can't await all the facts to come in, all the research to be done. In this kind of teaching, the person of the teaching is important to the learning of it, especially his willingness to die for what he believes. Religion B combines the immediacy of the aesthetic sphere with the decisive choice of the ethical sphere. So it's a little bit Hegelian here, even though Kierkegaard renounces Hegel. In religion B, you have a decisive choice, but you also have an immediacy, an immediate relationship with God. You get immense pleasure from it, as in the aesthetic stage, but also commitment to a great cause, as in the ethical stage. But it's a cause based on a relationship between you and God. So religion B is not conveyed through assent to propositional truth, but it's based on this passionate inwardness. Kierkegaard is interested in becoming a Christian within Christendom, and in order to do that, we need to put a whole lot more emphasis on our own choices, our own decisions, on the authenticity of our own life before God, living before Him as a whole person. How does this happen, you know? How do you change from being aesthetic to being ethical to being religious and to being religious in the right way? There's really no logical argument. that will take you from one to the other, because these are not just intellectual positions, these are lifestyle choices. And each one of them affects the way you live, the way you think, but everything that you do, it affects your evaluations. And if I say to my aesthetic friend, if I say, well, you shouldn't be living for pleasure alone, that's not ethically right, he might turn to me and say, who cares what's ethically right? I'm interested in what's fun. So his evaluations come from his own lifestyle, just as the ethical person's evaluations come from the ethicist lifestyle, and just like the religious person's evaluations come from the religious lifestyle. So you can't, in a way, argue a person from one lifestyle to another. There has to be a radical kind of change. And yet, people do make these changes. I mean, people sometimes go to college where they're footloose and fancy-free, and then 20 years later you come to a class reunion, and there the guy is a CEO of a major corporation and living to be a benefactor to the poor. Well, sometimes there's no figuring out how that happens. Kierkegaard's idea is basically that it's the work of God, at least in bringing people to religion B, which is true faith. It's the work of God. It's God's grace. It's only God who can transform us from within and transform all our habits and all our evaluations, our lifestyle, our thought, everything like that. So I think Kierkegaard is actually pretty good. I mean, in Reformed theology, maybe it's a problem that Kierkegaard was a Lutheran rather than a Calvinist, but in Reformed theology, we have ways of dealing with this, In Reformed theology, we have well, I'll put a triangle up on the board, even though you may not be seeing it, but at the top of the triangle, the N for normative perspective, the S for situational perspective, and the E for existential perspective. And the N represents the law, and the situation represents what God has done in history, the work of Christ for us. And then the existential perspective is what the Holy Spirit does in our hearts. And I think maybe Kierkegaard's concern about traditional Christianity is that there's an awful lot of law there and an awful lot of talk about historical events, but not much focus on the existential, not much focus on what happens in the heart, not enough focus on the direct relationship between God and ourselves. And I think really that's essentially the answer to Kierkegaard's problem of how you become a Christian within Christendom. It's essentially the Lord himself who turns people from being nominal Christians to being real Christians. And of course there are ways, we're told that there are such things as means of grace that the Holy Spirit uses to draw us into a more vital relationship with Christ. There's the Word, the sacraments, prayer, and fellowship. And the church can focus on those things, but not just as a way of maintaining tradition, but as a way of nurturing believers with a very, very careful understanding of what it means to meet the needs of people who are coming to the worship services.